June 16th, 1945, northern Luzon, Philippines. 200 Japanese women sat beneath a grove of palm trees, hands folded, eyes downcast. The air smelled of wet earth and distant smoke. American soldiers formed a loose perimeter around them, rifles slung but ready. The women had stopped trembling hours ago. Fear had given way to something colder acceptance. They believed the next sound would be the one that ended everything. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. Share any family memories from World War II, or just tell me what brought you here today. I read every single one, and your support keeps these stories alive. The women had rehearsed this moment in their minds for weeks. They had been told what capture meant. They had heard the stories, believed the propaganda, prepared for the worst. And then the Americans arrived carrying boxes instead of bayonets. Inside those boxes were things the women had never seen before: warm bundles, wrapped in wax paper, bottles with strange labels. The smell drifted across the clearing. Rich, savory, unfamiliar. In that moment, everything they had been told about the enemy began to collapse. They weren't being executed. They were being fed. By June 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, brutal phase. Japan's defensive perimeter had shattered across thousands of miles of ocean. American forces controlled the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Japanese supply lines had been severed. Entire units were isolated across the islands, cut off from command, running out of food, ammunition, and hope. On Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, over 150,000 Japanese troops had retreated into the mountain ranges of the north. General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded them from jungle strongholds, fighting not to win but to delay the inevitable. Among those forces were thousands of non-combatants, laborers, medical staff, women who had followed the army during earlier victories when Japan seemed unstoppable. These women occupied a gray zone in the Japanese military structure. Some had been recruited, others coerced. Many were classified under vague terms that offered no protection under military law. When the front collapsed, they became invisible. Officers prioritized soldiers. Supply chains prioritized weapons. The women were left to fend for themselves, walking deeper into the mountains as the American advance swept closer. They walked for days. Their rations ran out. Water came from streams when they could find them. At night they slept in the open or under makeshift shelters built from palm fronds. Some were sick. Others were injured. All of them were exhausted. They heard gunfire in the distance, growing closer each day. They knew the Americans were near. Japanese propaganda had been unambiguous. Surrender was disgrace. Capture meant torture. The Americans, they were told, showed no mercy. Stories circulated among the women tailies of prisoners executed, of humiliation, of violence. These stories had no basis in reality, but fear does not require facts. It only requires repetition. By the time the women huddled in that clearing beneath the palms, they had accepted their fate. They would die here. The only question was how. When the American patrol appeared on the ridgeline above them, the women froze. There was no resistance, no weapons, just silence. The soldiers approached cautiously, unsure what they were seeing. The patrol leader called for an interpreter. One of the women, trembling, stood and bowed. She expected a command. She expected the end. Instead, the sergeant asked if anyone was injured. The interpreter repeated the question in Japanese. No one answered. The women stared at the ground. One began to cry. Another gripped her neighbor's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. The sergeant looked at his men, then back at the women. He radioed for medical personnel and transport. The women were escorted to a clearing and told to sit. They obeyed without question. Soldiers moved around them, checking the perimeter, organizing equipment. The women watched every movement. They assumed this was preparation, that the Americans were simply being methodical before carrying out what they believed was inevitable. Then the boxes arrived. Soldiers unloaded metal containers from a truck. Steam rose when the lids were opened. The smell drifted across the clearing. It was rich, savory, unlike anything they had smelled in weeks. One soldier approached with a stack of wrapped bundles. He handed one to the nearest woman. She stared at it. She did not move. The sergeant gestured. He mimed eating. The woman slowly unwrapped the wax paper. Inside was a soft bun, a cooked patty, and something that looked like vegetables. She looked up at the soldier. He nodded. She took a small bite. Her eyes widened. It was food. Real food. And it was warm. Within minutes, every woman had been given the same thing, a hamburger. They ate slowly at first, unsure if this was allowed. Then hunger took over. The soft bread and seasoned beef were unlike anything they had tasted in months. Some cried as they ate. Others ate in silence, their hands shaking. The dissonance was overwhelming. They had expected death. They received dinner. Then came the bottles, clear glass filled with dark liquid. The women had no idea what it was. A soldier demonstrated how to open one. The cap popped off with a hiss. He handed it to a woman. She sniffed it, then took a sip. The carbonation startled her. She coughed. The sweetness was overwhelming. The soldier smiled. She took another sip. This was Coca-Cola. The gap between expectation and reality was unbridgeable. One woman later recalled that moment in an interview decades after the war. She said she had been certain the food was poisoned, that the Americans were simply making their deaths more comfortable. It was not until the next morning, when she woke up alive, that she began to believe otherwise. The women were transported to a temporary field camp near the town of Baguio. The camp was a collection of canvas tents, supply depots, and medical stations set up to process both military prisoners and displaced civilians. Upon arrival, they were divided into groups and assigned to processing stations. Each woman was asked basic questions through an interpreter: name, age, place of origin, military affiliation. The questions were clinical, not accusatory. The Americans recorded everything in neat handwriting on printed forms. The women answered quietly, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Medical personnel examined them next. Nurses checked for signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. Some women were given intravenous fluids. Others were prescribed rest and increased rations. The nurses worked efficiently, explaining each step through interpreters. The women complied. They had no other choice. After processing, the women were led to a row of tents designated for female detainees. Inside, they found metal cots with thin mattresses, blankets, and footlockers. The space was Spartan but clean. Everything was arranged in straight lines. The women stood in the tent for several minutes, unsure what to do. A nurse gestured for them to sit. They sat. That evening they were taken to the mess hall for dinner. The hall was a large tent with rows of tables and benches. American soldiers ate at one end. The women were seated at the other. The food was served cafeteria-style stew, bread, canned vegetables, and fruit. The portions were generous. The women ate slowly, still cautious, still waiting. The routine continued the next day. Wake-up call at dawn, breakfast, medical check, free time, lunch, light chores, dinner, lights out. The schedule was rigid and predictable. The women began to notice patterns. Meals arrived at the same time. Guards rotated shifts like clockwork. Medical staff followed protocols. Everything was organized. This was the first time many of the women had experienced American military efficiency. It was not harsh, it was not cruel. It was simply relentless in its consistency. Within a week, the women were transferred to a larger facility near Manila. This camp housed thousands of detainees, both military and civilian. The women were assigned to a section reserved for females. The barracks were wooden structures with raised floors, more comfortable than the tents. Work assignments began soon after. The women were given tasks suited to their health and abilities. Some cleaned barracks. Others sorted supplies or assisted in the camp laundry. A few with medical training helped in the infirmary. The work was not strenuous, but it was mandatory. Idleness was not allowed. Twice a week, groups of women were escorted to nearby agricultural plots. These small farms provided fresh vegetables for the camp kitchens. The women weeded, harvested, and washed produce. The work was familiar. Many had done similar labor in Japan. The rhythm of planting and picking was oddly comforting. During these work details, the women began to observe life outside the camp. Civilian trucks passed on the roads. Filipino families walked by. American soldiers went about their duties without hostility. The normalcy was striking. The war was still happening somewhere. But here, routines mattered more than conflict. Lunch during work details was often simple sandwiches, fruit, water, but occasionally the field kitchen sent out something different. Small hamburgers made from whatever beef was available. They were not as elaborate as the first ones, but the women recognized them immediately. The taste, the smell, the structure. It was familiar now. Coca-Cola also appeared at irregular intervals. Bottles were kept cold in metal containers filled with ice. Workers, including the prisoners, were given one each. The women had learned to anticipate the carbonation. Some even began to enjoy it. The sweetness cut through the heat and dust of the fields. One woman later wrote in a letter that the hamburgers and Coca-Cola became small markers of time. She could remember the weeks by which meals included them. She said it was strange to measure captivity by food, but it was the only constant that felt remotely positive. Inside the camp, a small canteen opened after the first month. It sold basic items, soap, writing paper, cigarettes, snacks. The women earned small amounts of scrip through their work assignments. They could spend it at the canteen. The shelves included canned goods, dried fruit, and bottles of Coca-Cola. The women bought them occasionally, more for the memory than the taste. The mess hall served hamburgers once or twice a week. When they appeared, the women noticed. The meals were not announced in advance, but the smell gave them away. Cooked beef and fresh bread carried across the camp. The women would enter the hall, see the trays, and feel a quiet sense of relief. Not because the food was special, but because it represented something they had come to trust. American soldiers ate the same meals. The women observed this carefully. The guards, the nurses, the kitchen staff, they all ate hamburgers without ceremony. It was not a luxury. It was simply food. This ordinariness was important. It meant the women were not being treated differently. They were being fed the same rations as everyone else. The women began to understand something fundamental about American culture. Food was functional. Meals were quick. Convenience mattered. This was different from Japan, where even simple meals followed structure and tradition. In America, a hamburger could be eaten standing up. A bottle of soda could be finished in 3 gulps. Efficiency was the point. This realization shaped how the women viewed their captivity. The Americans were not cruel, but they were not sentimental either. They followed rules because rules worked. They fed prisoners because regulations required it. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola were not gestures of kindness. They were standard operating procedure, and yet the memory of that first meal lingered. The women spoke about it quietly among themselves. They remembered the fear, the confusion, the moment when the sergeant handed them food instead of orders. That moment had been personal, even if everything after was procedural. By August 1945, the camp had settled into a steady rhythm. The women woke to the same bugle call. They ate the same meals. They performed the same chores. The predictability was numbing, but it was also safe. Fear had been replaced by routine. Then the war ended. The announcement came over loudspeakers in Japanese and English. Japan had surrendered. The women stood in the barracks listening. Some cried. Others sat in silence. A few felt relief. Most felt nothing. The war had ended weeks ago for them, the moment they were captured. The camp did not change immediately. The routines continued. Meals were served. Work details went on. The guards remained at their posts, but the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had hummed beneath everything dissolved. The women were no longer enemy prisoners. They were simply displaced persons waiting to go home. Repatriation took months. The logistics of transporting thousands of Japanese nationals across the Pacific required ships, scheduling, and coordination with Japanese authorities. The women waited. They worked. They ate. And occasionally they were served hamburgers. One evening in late September, the camp held a small event. It was not a celebration, but a recognition that the war was over. The mess hall served a special meal. The main course was hamburgers larger and better prepared than usual. There was fresh lettuce, sliced tomatoes, even pickles. Coca-Cola was provided in abundance. The women ate quietly. The meal was the same as the first one they had received 4 months earlier, but everything had changed. They were no longer terrified. They were no longer waiting for execution. They were simply eating. The hamburger tasted the same, but it meant something different now. In the years after the war, some of these women returned to Japan. They rebuilt their lives. They married, had children, grew old. Few spoke publicly about their experiences. The shame of being associated with the military, even as non-combatants, lingered in post-war Japan. But in private, some shared their stories. They remembered the jungle clearing. They remembered the fear. And they remembered the sergeant who handed them hamburgers instead of bullets. That moment became a fixed point in their memories, a hinge on which the rest of their lives turned. It was the moment they learned that not all enemies were cruel, that some followed rules that protected rather than destroyed. One woman interviewed in the 1980s said she never forgot the taste of that first hamburger. She said it was not the best meal she ever ate, but it was the most important, because it taught her that survival was possible, that the world could surprise you, that fear could be wrong. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola were never meant to be symbolic. The Americans were following regulations. They were feeding prisoners according to established guidelines. But symbols are not made by intention. They are made by memory. And for these women, those first bites of unfamiliar food became symbols of something larger, of order in chaos, of humanity in war, of the gap between what we are told and what is true. The last transport ships left Manila in early 1946. The women boarded in groups, carrying small bags of belongings. Many had nothing. They stood on the deck as the ship pulled away, watching the Philippines shrink into the distance. Some looked forward to home. Others dreaded it. Japan was devastated. Cities had been bombed. Millions were dead. The women returned to a country that did not know what to do with them. They blended back into society as best they could. They did not speak of hamburgers or Coca-Cola. Those memories belonged to a different world, but the memories stayed. In quiet moments, some of the women would recall the clearing, the palm trees, the Americans, the fear that turned into confusion, that turned into something fragile and unexpected. They remembered being certain they would die, and they remembered being wrong. Decades later, when American fast food chains opened in Japan, some of these women walked in. They ordered hamburgers. They drank Coca-Cola. And for a moment, they were back in the jungle, holding a warm bundle wrapped in wax paper, realizing that the world was far more complicated than they had been taught. They had expected cruelty. They received procedure. They had expected death. They received dinner. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something shifted. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just understanding. That even in war, sometimes the most radical act is simply following the rules. The story of these women is not one of heroism or triumph. It is a story of survival shaped by the smallest gestures: a hamburger, a bottle of soda, a moment when fear dissolved not because of grand speeches or moral declarations, but because someone handed them food and told them to eat, and they did, and they lived, and they remembered.